So let me describe the book a bit. First, I start by describing what Alma-Ata was like, because I was based in Alma-Ata in Kazakhstan, which is an interesting place, a good vantage point from which to observe the Soviet Union in many ways. I used to go to Moscow quite a lot, but to get a good idea of the country, it's always a good idea to have a look at the capital itself, as well as a very remote spot, to get an idea of what the country is really like from the inside. Then I turn to Soviet society, which I describe as very sort of freedom loving and free in many ways, but also not absolutely equal, you know, and, in contrast with many things I've said about the Soviet Union, it was still at the socialist change. So there was still inequality in the Soviet Union as a first step towards communism. So there's nothing particularly strange about that. And I tried to describe how unequal, obviously, society was a lot more equal than Western societies, but there was still some inequality, which I describe, which is sometimes inequality of power, inequality of work, inequality, of course, of salary, and which is reflected in many social attitudes. Then I turned to everyday life in Soviet Union, what it was like living there, problems that we face in everyday life, but also the general joie de vivre, which characterized the society, people's confidence in the future, and the impression people had of always moving forward. I describe, obviously, a couple of constraints, like shortages of different goods in the Soviet Union, and obviously the answers that people came up with to sort of cope with these shortages in everyday life. Then I turned to private life, and what it was like to live in the Soviet Union. And I argue that for minorities, really the Soviet Union wasn't a problem at all, because people were pretty much left to do what they wanted to do um, by themselves and in their own spheres. So sometimes things that were frowned on in public spheres were tolerated, 100% in the home. Obviously, I refer to the world of work in my next part, and to women's condition, of course, in the Soviet Union, and the advantages they had compared with what we can see in the ex-Soviet Union today. Equal pay, of course, and access to positions of influence. Also, advantages in the world of work, in terms of pensions, in terms of holiday homes. Then I turn to health and disability. Of course, health was free in the Soviet Union. Healthcare was. And there were a lot of interesting experiments with working with disabilities, for instance. After that, I turned to education like health. Is one of those things that most people seem to agree about the Soviet Union as one of their unquestioned successors. And sport, of course, as the world of sport was free of charge, and everyone was encouraged to do sport. Then I turned to the world of culture, and the fact that obviously a well-educated population was very much into culture, and that at the workplace, but also outside the home, people were encouraged to take part in clubs and all kinds of cultural activities from their youngest age. In the following part, I turn to science and the environment. I refer to some of the scientific achievements that the Soviet Union is famous for all around the world, but I also deal with day-to-day science, and once again, these scientific clubs that people would take part in just for pleasure or out of interest, or to meet people. The environment, I obviously deal with the Chernobyl crisis, as I was there at the time. But for instance, I refer to interesting facts like the one that in the Soviet Union, funnily enough, ex-Soviets never talk about Chernobyl as having been a problem. They refer to some events after and before Chernobyl, but in many ways, Chernobyl was made up to be something that it wasn't. As we can see today, Chernobyl has become a big holiday park in which, like some species of animals that had become extinct, have returned. But I do go into obviously the mistakes that were made by the Gorbachev administration concerning Chernobyl, and also how it was played up not only by the international media but by the Soviet government itself for purposes of its own. Then I move on to nationalities in the Soviet Union. Obviously, the Soviet Union. Well, just in Alma-Ata, for instance, there were 148 nationalities living together in perfect harmony most of the time, although they did joke about one another from time to time. And I obviously pay attention in great detail to what happened in Alma-Ata in 1986 with the so-called Kazakh uprising, which was obviously built up by the media in the West, like the Herald Tribune talked about 3,000 deaths, whereas only 3 people died all in all. But still, there's something that has to be dealt with. There were mistakes made by Gorbachev in that he replaced the General Secretary of the Communist Party, or the first secretary, um, uh, Nazarbayev, with a Russian, which didn't go down too well. Um, then I go on to look at the administrative system and, well, generally law and order in the Soviet Union, and the militia system, which worked very well. I can say that although in my life I can't say I've had particularly good relations with the police, either in the United Kingdom or in France, I must say I was impressed with the Soviet militia that always tried to improve things and not make things worse. In the following chapter, I deal with Soviet citizens' relations with outsiders. Well, Soviet citizens, foreign affairs, and the fact that foreigners were idolized in the Soviet Union. They were allowed to get away with anything, which says a lot about the Soviet Union and their openness on the world itself, as well as the degree of confidence of society and, if you like, the way they reached out to foreigners. Um, then I turn to history and religion. Obviously, I don't go into these problems per se, but I try to refer to people's attitudes towards Russian and Soviet history, world history, and religion itself. Then I get into the nitty gritty, so to say, the political life and the party itself, in which I consider the three issues surrounding the Communist Party that I talked about earlier on. After that, in the following chapter, I look at the media in the Soviet Union, which is always a strong point, but also a weakness, in that not everything was said about the weaknesses in the country itself, which caused people to doubt not only about what was really happening within the country, but also about whether what was being said about abroad was also true. Um, which led some people to question the party's politics themselves, or policies. And ideology in the Soviet Union, which I talked about earlier, that is to say, how ideological were the media, and whether there was any ideological debate at all, which there was in some spheres and not in others. This leads me to talk about perestroika itself, why it came about, how it came about, um, and then to the beginning of the end, how things started turning sour in the Soviet Union and Bulgaria. Obviously, some things about Perestroika was fantastic. For foreigners, the best place to be in the whole world. Why? Because in the cultural sphere, for instance, you had films, the theatre, all about world events and about the advance of socialism in the world, about problems within the capitalist world. But the problem was, it came all of a sudden, and it was too much at a time for people to swallow, for people who'd been used, if you like, to being told that things were as good as they could be in the Soviet Union itself. So this ended up really by confusing people more than anything else. And then I turn to my explanation of the downfall of the Soviet system and subsequently to, improvements and lessons for the future.